The first thing you should know about me is that I never intended to be here in the middle of nowhere with just an RV and a dog named Toby for company. My life has always been a string of one predictable event after another. A quiet desk job, a modest apartment, and a routine that would bore most people to tears. But I liked it that way. You could say I'm a creature of habit, or at least I was until last week. My name is Brendan Rolth, and I'm a tax accountant. Nothing flashy, just good with numbers, which I guess is why I enjoy the peace and quiet of the mountains. When my boss told me I had 2 weeks of vacation time I needed to use, I decided to take my old RV out for a spin. I packed up my things, loaded Toby into the RV, and set out for a secluded spot in the Pike National Forest in Colorado. The place was recommended by a friend, a real back to nature type. He said it was remote, peaceful, perfect for a bit of solitude. I drove for hours along winding mountain roads, Toby sitting in the passenger seat with his head out the window, tongue flapping in the wind. The deeper we got into the forest, the fewer cars we passed, until eventually it was just us and the trees. I found a clearing near a small, crystal clear lake, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. It was perfect. No cell service, no people, just me, Toby, and nature. I spent the first day setting up camp, hiking a bit, and generally unwinding. The lake was too cold for swimming, but it was peaceful to sit by the shore and watch the sun dip below the tree line. Toby seemed to enjoy the freedom, sniffing around the underbrush, chasing after squirrels, and generally having a blast. That first night, I made a simple dinner, canned chili heated over a propane stove, and ate it while the stars slowly filled the sky. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant rustling, which I found comforting. It reminded me of summer nights spent at my grandparents' cabin when I was a kid. I turned in early, exhausted from the drive and the fresh mountain air. The trouble started on the second day. I had been walking Toby along a narrow trail that looped around the lake when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked up, and he stared intently into the dense brush. At first, I thought he had spotted another squirrel, but then I noticed the hairs on the back of his neck were standing on end. He was growling softly, something I had never heard him do before. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, peering into the trees. I couldn't see anything, but the underbrush was thick and the shadows deep. Toby barked sharply, pulling on the leash, trying to drag me back toward the campsite. The dog was normally well behaved, but now he was frantic, eyes wide, ears flattened. I decided to trust his instincts and headed back, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, once comforting, now seemed oppressive. The wind rustled the pine branches, and the shadows they cast on the ground shifted and twisted. Toby was unusually quiet, lying close to the fire with his eyes constantly darting to the tree line. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I'd been alone out here for a couple of days with nothing but my own thoughts and the occasional wildlife for company. I was halfway through a beer when I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible sound, like a heavy breath or a deep exhale. It was close, too close. Toby shot up, barking furiously, his hackles raised. I grabbed the flashlight and swept it across the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the RV, the fire pit, but nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or a bear, but the unease only grew. Toby refused to settle down, growling at the darkness, his eyes fixed on the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going, tossing in more logs whenever the flames started to die down. Toby stayed close, his head resting on my lap, but his eyes never left the tree line. Every now and then, I would hear that low, almost inaudible sound again, and I would grip the flashlight a little tighter. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The strange noises had stopped sometime in the early hours of the morning, but Toby remained on edge. I decided to pack up and leave early, cutting the trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. As I was packing up the campsite, I noticed something odd. About 20 feet from where I'd been sitting by the fire, the ground was disturbed, as if something heavy had been dragged across the dirt. The pine needles were scattered, and there were deep grooves in the earth, like claw marks. I bent down to get a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A single massive footprint, far too large to be a bear's. The print was vaguely human in shape, but elongated, with toes that ended in sharp points. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the implications slowly sinking in. This was no bear. No animal I could easily identify. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to leave its mark. I hurried the rest of the packing, throwing everything into the RV haphazardly. Toby was already inside, whining anxiously. I took one last look around the campsite before climbing into the driver's seat, my mind racing. The sun was up now, casting long shadows across the ground, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I started the engine and pulled out of the clearing, the tires crunching over the gravel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something come barreling out of the trees behind me, but the road remained empty. After a few tense minutes, I started to relax. I told myself that I was overreacting, that it was probably just some trick of the light, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing in my sleep-deprived state. But as I turned onto the main road, I saw it, standing on the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with an unsettling fluidity, like it was made of water. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but Toby's frantic barking snapped me back to reality. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I sped down the road. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. Not until I was miles away from that cursed forest did I pull over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that shouldn't exist in the real world. And yet there it was, as real as the ground beneath my feet. Eventually, I started the engine again and drove the rest of the way home without stopping. I haven't told anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? I'm just a numbers guy, after all, not some conspiracy theorist or monster hunter. But every night since then, I've locked all the doors and windows, and I can't bring myself to go anywhere near the woods. As for that footprint, the one I saw near the campsite, I didn't take a picture, didn't collect any evidence. But it's there in my memory, as clear as day, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the places we least expect. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. All I care about is that I got out of there in one piece. And if you're ever thinking of camping in the Pike National Forest, take my advice. Find somewhere else. There's something out there, something that shouldn't exist, and it's better to leave it be. It's funny how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, doing something I swore I'd never do. You see, I've always been more of a city guy, the kind who enjoys the hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the comfort of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Memvin, and I was an investment banker, a workaholic who never took a break until I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't severe, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on time away from the office. So, after some soul searching and pressure from my family, I bought an RV and hit the road, determined to find peace in nature. I figured, why not try camping? Maybe it would do me some good. That's how I found myself in the deep woods of West Virginia, miles away from anything remotely civilized, the Monongahela National Forest, a name that was hard enough to pronounce, let alone appreciate. The forest was vast, dense, and eerily quiet, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. At first, it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The air was crisp, the trees were towering, and the sky, when visible through the canopy, was a deep blue I hadn't seen in years. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a small stream, far enough from the usual campsites to avoid any intrusions. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day went by uneventfully. I hiked a bit, read a book, and tried my hand at fishing. Unsuccessfully, of course. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked some canned beans. It was all very rustic, and I almost enjoyed it. Almost. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came a silence so profound that it felt oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your thoughts grow louder. I was just settling into my RV, preparing to call it a night, when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other harmless creature, but the sound grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and the occasional glint of light reflecting off leaves. The rustling stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and went to bed, feeling a bit silly for being spooked by the wilderness. The next day, I decided to hike a little farther from the campsite, maybe explore some of the less traveled trails. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding through dense trees and over rocky terrain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was absurd. Of course, there was no one out here. No signs of other campers or hikers, just me and the forest. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something odd. A clearing, circular and unnaturally perfect, as if the trees had been cut down deliberately to make space. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, maybe a forgotten altar or shrine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, noticing strange carvings on the stones, symbols I didn't recognize etched deeply into the rock. I reached out to touch one, feeling the roughness of the stone under my fingers when I heard it again. The rustling. Only this time it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was hitting the ground repeatedly. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe an animal, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty, save for the trees that encircled it like silent sentinels. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, in a clearing that suddenly felt much less inviting. I decided to head back to the RV, quickening my pace, the sense of unease growing with every step. When I returned to the campsite, everything was as I had left it. The fire pit was cold, the RV untouched, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had intensified. I spent the rest of the day close to the RV, not wanting to venture out again. As dusk fell, I started a fire, hoping the flames would bring some comfort. They didn't. The night was darker than before, the shadows deeper, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I heard the rustling again, closer this time, and that same thumping noise. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but no explanation seemed to fit. I retreated into the RV, locking the door once more and checking all the windows. I had a small hunting knife with me, a last-minute purchase at a roadside shop, and I kept it close, feeling more ridiculous by the minute. But then the RV shook, not a slight tremor, but a forceful jolt, as if something had rammed into it. I froze, gripping the knife, waiting for another impact. It came seconds later, harder this time, accompanied by a screeching sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever it was to break in. I had to do something. My mind raced through options, but none of them seemed feasible. Running into the woods was out of the question. I didn't even know what was out there. Staying in the RV felt like a death sentence. The creature, because that's what it had to be, a creature of some kind, was ramming the RV with increasing force, each impact causing the metal to groan and creak. In a burst of adrenaline, I threw open the RV door and bolted out, knife in hand, running in the direction of the clearing. I didn't know why I chose that direction. Maybe because it was the only place I knew, or maybe because some instinct told me to go there. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and I could barely see where I was going. But I could hear it, the thumping, the rustling, the heavy breathing of whatever was chasing me. I reached the clearing, panting and desperate, and for a moment, everything was silent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then, from the shadows, it emerged, a hulking figure, covered in coarse, matted fur, standing on two legs like a man, but with a face that was all wrong. It was like a wolf, but its features were distorted, stretched, and twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes, God, those eyes, were wide and wild, reflecting the faint light of the moon. As it stepped closer, I backed away, heart pounding, knife trembling in my hand. The creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just a knife, but there was nowhere to run. The creature lunged at me, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. I barely had time to react, slashing wildly with the knife as it came at me. The blade connected with something solid, and the creature let out a howl of pain. But it didn't stop. It knocked me to the ground, the force of its attack sending the knife flying out of my hand. I struggled, kicking and punching anything to keep those jaws away from my throat, but it was too strong, its weight pinning me down as it snapped at me, its breath hot and foul against my face. In a last-ditch effort, I reached for a rock, smashing it against the creature's head with all the strength I could muster. It recoiled, stunned, and I took the opportunity to scramble away, grabbing the knife as I went. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the fear or the desperation, but I turned and charged at the creature, plunging the knife into its side. It let out another howl, thrashing violently, but I held on, driving the blade deeper. Blood, thick and dark, poured from the wound, covering my hands and the ground beneath us. The creature shuddered, its strength waning, and finally collapsed with a final, shuddering breath. I stood there, panting, covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of the creature at my feet. For a moment, I couldn't believe it was over, that I had actually survived. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight of the night lifting slightly. I stumbled back to the RV, knife still in hand, and sat down, my mind numb with shock. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the blood-stained knife, But eventually the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't feel relief, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I knew I had to leave, to get out of this place before anything else happened. But first, I needed to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I walked back to the clearing, half expecting the body to be gone, for the creature to have vanished like some nightmare. I've always had a knack for fixing things. Engines, plumbing, electrical work. You name it, I could fix it. It's why I became an RV mechanic in the first place. I enjoyed the freedom of the road, the satisfaction of a job well done, and the occasional break from the city. There's something peaceful about spending a few days in the wilderness, just me and my old RV, tuning out the world for a while. My name's Travis O'Hara, and I guess you could say I've lived a pretty unremarkable life. I'm not married, don't have any kids, and my social circle is more like a dot than a full-fledged circle. But that's okay by me. The solitude never bothered me much. I'm the kind of guy who finds comfort in the hum of an engine, the scent of gasoline, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I suppose that's why I took to RV camping. Just me, my tools, and the open road. This time I decided to head out to the Big Thicket in Texas. Not the most famous spot, but that's why I liked it. The dense forests, the quiet trails, and the rare chance of running into anyone made it perfect for a weekend getaway. Plus, the old RV needed a test run after some repairs, and what better place to do it than out there, surrounded by nothing but nature? I set up camp in a secluded spot far from the main trail. The trees were thick, their canopies interlocking overhead like a natural roof. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of birds and the occasional rustle of a breeze through the underbrush. It was perfect. The first day went by without a hitch. I spent most of it tinkering with the RV, tightening bolts here, checking fluid levels there, and making sure everything was running smoothly. By dusk, I had a small fire going and a can of chili warming up. The sky was a dull gray, thick clouds blotting out the stars, but I didn't mind. The isolation was what I had come for. I should have known better when I heard the first sound that night. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me pause mid-bite. It sounded like a cry, low, drawn out, almost mournful. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized, but I brushed it off as the wind playing tricks. There were all sorts of noises out in the woods, and most of them were harmless. The second night, though, was when things took a turn. I had spent the day hiking through the woods, snapping photos of the local flora, and just enjoying the quiet. As night fell, I settled back into the routine, fire, canned dinner, and the comfort of solitude. But this time, the cry came earlier, louder, and closer. It echoed through the trees, a hollow, haunting wail that sent a shiver through me despite the warm fire. I'm not one to spook easily, but there was something about that sound that unsettled me. I tried to convince myself it was just some animal, maybe a wounded deer or a coyote in distress, but the sound was different, too human almost, the kind of noise you'd expect from someone lost, someone in pain. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it again, just at the edge of the darkness, as if whatever was making it was circling my camp. By the third day, I was ready to pack up and leave. There's only so much weirdness a man can take, and I'd reached my limit. But as I started to stow my gear, I noticed something odd. Scratches along the side of the RV. They weren't deep, more like superficial scrapes, but they were definitely new. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough grooves etched into the metal, and my stomach twisted. Whatever had made those marks had claws, and it had gotten close, too close for comfort. That night, the crying returned, louder and more desperate. It was closer now, almost as if it was right outside the RV. I had barricaded myself inside, every door locked, every window sealed. The sound wasn't just outside, it was all around me, echoing through the trees, reverberating off the metal walls of the RV. I could feel it vibrating through the floor, rattling the dishes in the cupboards. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. Heavy, oppressive silence, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't dare move, didn't even breathe for what felt like an eternity. But then I heard it, a soft thud like something heavy had hit the ground. It came from the front of the RV, right near the hood. I grabbed my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest, and slowly crept toward the front. The air was thick with tension, every step sending a creak through the old wooden floor. When I finally worked up the nerve to peer out the windshield, I saw it. At first, it looked like a large animal, a bear, maybe, or a wolf. But as the light from my flashlight cut through the darkness, I realized it was something far more sinister. It was hunched over, its back arched unnaturally, long limbs stretched out across the hood of the RV. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and covered in a thin layer of something like moss or algae, but it was the face that stopped my heart cold. A face that was almost human but distorted, stretched out of proportion, with a jaw that hung open far wider than it should. It was crying, no, wailing, the same hollow, haunting cry that had echoed through the woods for the past 2 nights. But now, it was right there in front of me, and there was no mistaking it for an animal. This thing, whatever it was, had found me. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed the nearest weapon I had, a tire iron, and swung open the RV door. I charged out, adrenaline pumping, ready to face whatever this thing was. But as I approached, it turned those hollow, empty sockets toward me, and I froze. And I froze. It didn't attack, didn't move, it just stared, its mouth still open, the wail still pouring out. I swung the tire iron with all my strength. The metal connected with a sickening crunch. The creature collapsed, a heap of pale limbs and twisted features. But the sound didn't stop. The wail continued, even as it lay there motionless. A low, mournful echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I backed away, panting, my hands shaking. I half expected it to get back up, to lunge at me, but it didn't move. It just lay there, the sound finally fading into the night, leaving nothing but the rustle of the wind through the trees. I didn't stick around after that. I packed up the RV as fast as I could and hit the road, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed place. When I finally reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They didn't believe me at first. Who would? But when they found the scratches on the RV, the dent in the hood, and the remains of whatever that thing was still stuck in the grill, they started to take me seriously. I don't know what it was that I killed out there in the big thicket. Maybe some kind of mutant or a creature that had never been documented before. But one thing's for sure, I won't be going back to find out. And as I drove away, leaving that town and that nightmare behind, the last remnants of the creature's wail echoed faintly in my mind. But I pushed it away, focusing on the road ahead, determined to forget the hollow cry of the thing that had once stalked the woods. The end was silent, like the night had swallowed the sound whole, and I didn't look back. Never thought I'd be the guy to fall in love with RV camping, but life has a way of surprising you. Just last year, I was a corporate drone stuck in a soulless cubicle under fluorescent lights that made everything look like a hospital waiting room. I was drowning in spreadsheets, wondering if I'd ever feel truly alive again. That's when I saw an ad for an RV dealership in Tennessee, and on a whim, I traded in my monotonous existence for a new life on the road. Now I spend my days exploring the back roads of America, savoring the solitude that comes with finding a spot miles away from the nearest person. That's what led me to the woods outside of Jonesboro, Tennessee. It's a quaint little town with a population that couldn't fill a high school football stadium. I had parked my RV in a clearing deep in the forest, far from the nearest trail. The canopy of trees above made it feel like I was in my own little world, separate from everything and everyone. That's exactly how I wanted it. The first 2 days were blissful. I hiked, read books, and even tried my hand at cooking over an open fire. The silence was addictive, until it wasn't. On the third night, things took a turn. It was past midnight, and I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the occasional crackle of burning wood. The sky was a dark, inky black, dotted with stars. It was the kind of peace you could only find out here, away from the clamor of civilization. Then I heard it. A rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't the usual scurrying of a small animal. This was something larger, something deliberate. I froze, straining my ears to catch the sound again. The rustling stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to relax and went inside the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found tracks near the edge of the clearing. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Long, narrow impressions that looked almost like the claw marks of some gigantic bird. I crouched down, tracing the outline with my fingers, trying to make sense of it. There were no animals in these woods that could make tracks like this. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut, but I pushed it out of my mind and went about my day. I hiked a different trail, hoping to find a spot that offered a better view of the mountains. But even the breathtaking scenery couldn't fully distract me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my nerves on edge, half expecting something to be following me. That night, I decided to sleep inside the RV instead of setting up my tent outside. I bolted the door and pulled the curtains closed, trying to create a barrier between myself and whatever was out there. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the RV's windows. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. It didn't. Instead, I heard a soft scraping sound, like nails dragging along metal. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized the sound was coming from the RV's roof. Something was up there, moving slowly, deliberately. I stayed perfectly still, too terrified to move as the scraping continued. It circled the roof, pausing every few feet as if it were searching for a way inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found deep gouges on the roof of the RV. Whatever had been up there had left its mark. The scratches were deep, cutting through the metal as if it were nothing. Panic began to creep at the edges of my mind. I needed to leave, to get out of these woods and back to civilization, but something kept me rooted in place. It was as if the forest had taken hold of me, refusing to let me go. I spent the day pacing the clearing, my thoughts racing. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was a bear, though I'd never heard of a bear climbing on top of an RV. Maybe it was a prank, though who would be out here miles from anywhere in the middle of the night? As the sun dipped below the horizon, my anxiety reached a fever pitch. I considered driving off right then, but the thought of navigating the narrow, winding forest road in the dark was too daunting. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I didn't bother with the fire. I locked myself in the RV and sat in the driver's seat, keys in hand, ready to turn the ignition at the first sign of trouble. Hours passed, and the tension in my muscles never eased. I must have drifted off at some point because I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the side of the RV. I nearly jumped out of my skin, my heart pounding as I fumbled to turn on the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in front of me. For a moment, everything was still. Then something moved at the edge of the light. A flash of something pale and lanky, too quick for me to make out any details. I slammed the RV into gear and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and I lurched forward, barreling down the forest road as fast as I could manage. The RV bounced and jolted over the uneven terrain, but I didn't dare slow down. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of it. A tall, emaciated figure running on all fours. Its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its body covered in matted fur, and its head was grotesquely elongated, resembling that of a deer, but with a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It kept pace with the RV, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if it were gliding over the ground. I don't know how long I drove like that, heart-pounding, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. At some point, the road widened, and I saw the dim glow of distant headlights through the trees. Civilization. I pushed the RV to its limits, praying that I'd make it out of the forest alive. The creature suddenly stopped, retreating into the darkness as if it had hit an invisible barrier. I didn't dare slow down until I reached the highway, the safety of other cars finally making me feel like I wasn't alone in the world anymore. I never looked back. I drove straight to the nearest town and parked in a well-lit lot, surrounded by the comforting hum of humanity. I stayed there the rest of the night, locked in the RV, waiting for the morning light. When dawn broke, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The scratches on the RV were still there, a tangible reminder of the nightmare I had escaped. I knew I had to get them fixed, but not just yet. I needed them to be seen, to be believed. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't plan to. The RV sits in storage now, and I'm back to a more conventional life, the kind that doesn't involve waking nightmares. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear the sound of nails dragging across metal, and I know it's not just in my head. The creature, whatever it was, is still out there in those woods, but I'm not going to be the one to find out what happens next. Camping in the RV was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a quiet retreat into nature for my girlfriend and me, far away from the chaos of everyday life. We had chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from the lights of the city, where the only sound was the wind through the trees. It was perfect. We set up camp, lit a fire, and eagerly anticipated an evening under the stars. Little did we know the nights ahead would bring horrors far darker than we could ever have imagined. On our first night, as we roasted marshmallows by the fire, a figure caught our attention, an RV parked in the distance. It was old, rusted, almost forgotten by time. We didn't think much of it. After all, this was a campground. People came and went. But then we saw him. The man pacing around the RV, his face contorted in anguish. He was calling out, but his voice barely cut through the crackling of the fire. Desperation laced his words, and there was something in the way he moved that made my stomach tighten. I couldn't help it. Curiosity gnawed at me, and against my better judgment, I approached him. His name was John. His face was drawn and gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wild with panic as he explained that he was searching for his 7-year-old son, Sam. They had gone hunting earlier that day, but Sam had disappeared in the woods. His voice cracked with terror as he described the child's sudden vanishing. He had scoured the woods, but there was no trace of the boy. The authorities weren't due until the next morning, and John was alone, frantic, desperate. We offered to help, but he refused. He'd already searched every inch of the area. The sound of his trembling voice echoed in my mind as I returned to my camp, feeling helpless, disturbed by the deep despair in his eyes. That night, as we tried to sleep, the sound of faint crying drifted to us through the walls of the RV. It was soft at first, so soft I wondered if it was just the wind. But no, it was unmistakably human. A child's cry. My girlfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances. We couldn't ignore it, but neither of us wanted to venture out alone. We waited, hoping the sound would fade, but it lingered, sporadic, pitiful. A cry that gnawed at the edges of our sanity. By morning, the sound had disappeared, but the unsettling feeling it left behind remained. The next day was no better. We hiked, but the woods felt wrong, thick with silence, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. As night fell and the darkness pressed in, we gathered around the campfire, trying to distract ourselves from something that clung to us like a second skin. That's when we heard it again. The sound of a child crying. This time, it was louder, closer, so close that it made my heart race in my chest. I stood up, scanning the dark trees for any sign of movement. The cries grew louder, more frantic, until, out of the blackness, a figure emerged. A boy, no older than 7, his clothes torn, dirty, his face streaked with tears. He stumbled toward the fire, shaking with fear, his eyes locked onto mine, wide and unblinking, as he whispered between sobs, "I'm looking for my dad." My stomach turned. This was wrong. This wasn't some lost child. We tried to comfort him, but he could barely speak through his hysteria. He was too terrified to form coherent words. I turned to the RV, hoping to grab some food to calm him, and when I returned, my girlfriend had gone to fetch more firewood. But when we both came back, the boy was gone. Vanished. We called out for him, searched the woods in a panic, but there was nothing, no trace. The night swallowed up every sign of him, leaving us with nothing but the oppressive silence of the woods. That night, sleep came in fits, each creak of the RV a reminder that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had just experienced something we couldn't understand. We researched the area once we were home, desperate for answers, and what we found sent a cold shiver down our spines. 15 years earlier, the very same woods had been the site of a disappearance. A father and his young son had gone hunting and never returned. The search had dragged on for weeks, but neither had been found. The report spoke of the father's frantic search for his son, and the son's desperate cries for his father. The details matched, too perfectly. The father's despair, the boy's age. It was all there. It hit us then. The child we had seen, the father's voice on the wind, like it wasn't just a coincidence. The man we had met, John, wasn't just a man. He was a ghost, lost in the same woods, trapped in a never-ending search for his son. The boy we had seen wasn't alive. He was the spirit of that lost child, forever looking for his father. The cries we had heard, the desperation, the terror, everything had been a haunting echo of a tragedy that never truly ended. We don't go back to that campsite, and every time we hear about someone going missing in the woods, we wonder, are they lost, or are they just another pair of spirits wandering the forest forever, caught in the same nightmare that we stumbled into? The nights we spent there will never be forgotten, a reminder of the ghostly search for a child lost in time and the soul-crushing echoes of a father's call, never answered. I remember my mom always said that life is a series of calculated risks, and for the longest time I believed her. I'm Bree Mallister, a man who's spent most of his life calculating every decision with precision. As a mechanical engineer, I trusted the unwavering certainty of numbers and the unyielding reliability of machines. But no formula, no equation could have prepared me for what awaited me in the Oregon wilderness. The forest has always been my sanctuary, the silence that smothers you, the towering trees that feel like ancient sentinels guarding a forgotten world. So when I finally had a few days off from work, I decided to escape the noise of life and head to Tillamook State Forest. I had heard the name whispered in passing, but had never set foot there. The woods were denser than I'd imagined, thick with Douglas firs and western hemlocks that blotted out the sun. The narrow, winding roads slithered through the hills like a serpent. But I was undeterred, intoxicated by the thought of true isolation. I found a small clearing hidden away from the usual crowds. There was no one else around, just me and the forest. It was perfect, an escape from everything. I set up camp, wandered the woods taking photos, and marveled at the life that surrounded me. The calls of birds, the rustle of creatures in the underbrush, and the eerie howl of a distant coyote echoed through the trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker, the air heavier. I lit a fire, roasted a couple of hot dogs, and cracked open a beer, sinking into a fold-out chair. The quiet was almost unbearable, but in a strange way, it was comforting. Then something shifted. A deep, rumbling growl pierced the air. It wasn't the wind, nor an animal I could identify. It wasn't natural. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, playing tricks on my mind. But the sound came again, closer. A heavy thud, like something massive moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, straining to see into the shadowy edges of the clearing. It was too dark to make anything out, but I knew something was out there. The forest, usually so alive with sounds, felt wrong. This wasn't a bear or a cougar. There was an intelligence to the movement, a deliberation. I grabbed the flashlight from inside the RV and swept the beam across the tree line. The shadows stretched and flickered as the light danced over them, but nothing moved. Then it came again, closer, louder, more insistent. I could feel it now, the weight of something watching me, stalking me. I should have gone inside, locked the door, and waited for dawn. But something rooted me in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the belief that nothing could hurt me out here, not with all my training and experience. I didn't know. I only knew that when the first scream split the air, a horrible, otherworldly sound that twisted in my ears like grinding gears, I snapped. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The scream echoed through the trees, reverberating with a jagged metallic edge that sliced into my very soul. My hands trembled as I swung the flashlight in every direction, searching for the source. And then I saw it. A shape, massive, looming, moving with terrifying speed through the trees. My throat closed up. I couldn't breathe. The beam of light caught it, and for a moment I just stared in horror. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and bristling like the spines of some twisted creature. But it wasn't the fur that made me freeze. It was the size. This thing towered over me, easily 8 feet tall, with a hulking, muscular frame that rippled like liquid steel. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, ending in claws that could rip through flesh or metal with ease. And its face, my God, its face. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. The snout was twisted like something between a boar and a nightmare, with tusks jutting out at grotesque angles. But it was the mouth that shattered my sanity, wide, impossibly wide, lined with rows of jagged teeth that gleamed in the flashlight's glow. Nothing about it made sense. It wasn't supposed to exist. But there it was, staring at me with eyes, or something like eyes, that burned with an intelligence far too ancient and malicious to comprehend. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted toward the RV, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. My legs moved on sheer terror, stumbling over the uneven ground as I heard the thing crashing behind me, moving at a speed that defied belief. I reached the RV, slammed the door shut, and locked it with shaking hands. I barely got the key into the ignition, but somehow the engine roared to life. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward, gravel kicking up behind me. But the creature wasn't finished. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, bursting from the trees, its eyes, or whatever they were, glowing in the darkness. It was gaining on me, moving faster than should have been possible. Its limbs were a blur of motion, propelling it forward with terrifying speed. I pushed the RV harder, but it wasn't enough. With a single impossible leap, the creature soared over the RV, landing with a deafening thud directly in front of me. I swerved, narrowly missing it. But the RV hit loose gravel and the world spun as it skidded sideways and crashed into a tree. The impact threw me forward, my head slamming into the steering wheel, and everything went black. When I came to, the creature was gone. The RV was a crumpled heap of metal, steam hissing from the engine. My head throbbed, blood trickling down my forehead, but I was alive. Barely. Dazed, I stumbled out of the wreckage, the silence of the forest pressing in on me. It was too quiet, too still. I waited for the creature to return, to finish what it had started, but it never did. I don't know how long I stood there, the events of the night swirling in a fog, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I gathered what little I could from the RV and began to walk. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away. Eventually, I reached a rundown gas station. The attendant eyed me like I was a ghost, but I didn't care. I asked him to call the police. I didn't mention the creature. I knew no one would believe me. When the police arrived, I gave them a vague story about swerving to avoid a deer. They bought it, or at least didn't question me further. They towed the RV and left me at the gas station to wait for a ride. I haven't been back to Tillamook State Forest since that night. I never will. But sometimes when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in around me, I hear it again, the rumbling growl that doesn't belong in this world. And I wonder, but I don't let myself finish the thought. I just keep moving forward, one step at a time, trying not to look back. I was headed for the Olympic National Park, seeking a weekend of solitude, the kind where you can escape everything: work, expectations, the noise of city life. My phone was on airplane mode, buried in my bag, as I sought refuge in nature. I wasn't one of those guys obsessed with the grind. I learned early that life was more than punching a clock. When my father passed away a few years ago, I promised myself I'd stop chasing endless tasks and start savoring moments of peace. My old man used to say I was too stubborn for my own good, and maybe he was right. But it was that very stubbornness that kept me going through tough times, and right now I needed a break from the chaos. My RV was my escape, an old beat-up model I bought for cheap from a buddy. It wasn't glamorous, but it had a certain charm. Every creak of it reminded me of adventures past. I had my route planned out, deep into the park's lesser-traveled corners, a place where I could find quiet without a throng of other campers. My destination? A small lake, tucked away in a dense, untouched part of the woods, the kind of spot where you could hear your own thoughts. After hours on the road, I finally arrived. The sun was dipping low, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The air was cool, thick with the earthy scent of pine and moss. It was the kind of evening that wrapped around you like a comforting blanket. I set up camp, stoking a fire for dinner. The night wrapped itself around me, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Peace. This was exactly what I needed. But then I heard it. A sound. A low, strange noise from the forest. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else moving through the brush, but it wasn't random. It had a rhythm to it. Slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the dark tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, searching. Probably just an animal, I told myself, trying to shake off the creeping unease. But as soon as the light hit the trees, the footsteps stopped, as if whatever it was had frozen, watching. I waited, my breath shallow, straining to hear anything, but nothing. Silence again. I muttered a laugh, trying to dismiss it, but deep down, something felt wrong. Throwing a few more logs onto the fire, I hoped the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. The night dragged on, and eventually I crawled into the RV, locking the door behind me. Not because I thought I was in danger, but out of habit. I tried to sleep, but the tiniest sounds, the wind, the creak of the RV, had me on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer now, much closer. My heart slammed in my chest as I sat up in bed. The footsteps circled the RV, slow and steady. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, but I didn't move to the window. Something, an instinct, a primal warning, told me not to. I just listened. The steps dragged on, circling, pacing, until, without warning, they stopped. I sat frozen, barely breathing. Time stretched, the silence deafening. No more footsteps, no movement, only the thudding of my own pulse in my ears. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before sleep claimed me, exhaustion finally overtaking my fear. When I woke the next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun streamed through the RV's windows, casting a golden light on the world outside. But the sense of unease gnawed at me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I stepped outside, squinting against the daylight. The ground around the RV was disturbed. Not like animals, but something heavy, something massive had walked around in circles. The tracks were huge, far too large for any deer or bear. Deep impressions in the dirt suggested something strong, something powerful had been here. Then I saw it. Broken branches, torn earth leading into the forest. Whatever had made these marks was still out there. My stubbornness kicked in. Maybe that's what got me into trouble, but I had to know what had been lurking around my camp. I grabbed my hunting knife, strapped it to my belt, and followed the trail. The forest grew darker, thicker as I moved deeper in. The sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy above, and the air grew colder, heavier. The trail wound on, far beyond where I'd ever dared to venture before. The unease I felt in the pit of my stomach grew, clawing at my insides, but I pressed forward. Then I noticed something. There were two sets of tracks, the large, heavy ones, and another set, smaller, lighter, as though something was following the larger creature. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a jagged rock formation, a natural altar. The ground around it was littered with bones, small bones, large bones, some human. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. And then I saw it, the creature. It was massive, over 7 feet tall, its fur matted and dirty, a dark brown that blended with the shadows. Its limbs were long, too long, and its hands, no, claws. Long, curved, perfect for rending flesh. But it was the face that stopped me cold. A grotesque mix of a bear and a wolf, its long snout filled with jagged teeth that seemed to stretch at unnatural angles. Its eyes, those small, beady eyes set deep in its skull, were cold and knowing. Dark intelligence flickered behind them. And then I saw what it was holding, the remains of a person, or what had been a person. Torn apart, scattered around the rock like some twisted offering, The stench of blood, of death, filled the air, and my stomach churned, threatening to empty itself. It hadn't noticed me yet. For a brief moment, a terrifying, insane thought crossed my mind. I could kill it. But before I could make a move, it sniffed the air. Its eyes locked onto mine. Everything inside me screamed to run. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. Branches whipped against my face, my legs burning. But I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth. Closer, closer. Its breath came in ragged, animalistic gasps, as if it were savoring the chase. The RV. I could see it now, just ahead. I threw the door open, slamming it shut just as the creature slammed into the side of the RV, shaking it violently, nearly toppling it off its wheels. I scrambled into the driver's seat, hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I floored the gas, tearing out of the campsite without a second thought. I didn't dare look back. I drove for hours, not slowing until I reached the main road. Only then, when I was safely on pavement, did I allow myself to breathe. The adrenaline began to wear off, but the fear, it didn't leave. It clung to me, wrapped around my bones, a constant reminder that whatever that thing was, it was still out there, waiting. When I reported what happened, they didn't believe me. They sent a team to investigate. They found the campsite just as I had left it, the remains near the rock, but they never found the creature. I know it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, and some mysteries, I think, are best left unsolved. The decision to rent an RV for a weekend escape had seemed like one of the best I'd ever made, or so I thought at the time. My name is Joel Lasker, and I've always been a city boy, glued to my computer for hours on end, programming or binge-watching old sci-fi series. But after a brutal breakup and a work deadline that nearly crushed me, I knew I needed something different. I needed to get away from the suffocating walls of my tiny apartment, away from the relentless hum of screens. I wasn't exactly a nature enthusiast, but the thought of driving off into some remote wilderness, far from the noise, the people, and the pain, seemed like the perfect antidote. That's how I found myself heading towards Black River National Forest, a place I'd heard of only in passing, but that sounded remote enough to offer the solitude I craved. Black River wasn't one of those polished, well-known national parks. It was tucked away in the northern reaches of Michigan, a dark, untamed expanse that swallowed up sunlight and vibrated with a strange, almost suffocating quiet. I arrived to find it completely deserted, exactly as I had hoped. No cell service, no internet, just me, the RV, and the oppressive silence of the forest. I parked near a small, secluded lake I'd found on the map. The water, a mirror of the towering pines around it, was still, reflecting the deep green and the eerie stillness of the place. It was beautiful, serene, almost surreal. The first day was peaceful. I hiked around, taking photos, breathing in the crisp air, reveling in the silence. By nightfall, I built a fire, the flames flickering against the encroaching dark, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was at ease. The next morning, I decided to venture deeper into the woods. There were no marked trails, just a vast, labyrinthine forest, and I figured my decent sense of direction would keep me from getting lost. But the deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in on me. The forest grew darker, the canopy above swallowing up the light until I could barely see the sky. That's when I found it. At first, I thought it was just another fallen tree, a casualty of a storm or old age. But as I drew closer, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What I was looking at wasn't just any fallen log. It was something massive, at least 20 feet long, covered in thick, matted fur so dark it looked almost black in the dim light. Its body was twisted as if it had been violently thrown from a great height, or savagely attacked. I wasn't a hunter, nor was I an expert in wildlife, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't any ordinary animal. It resembled a bear, but it was wrong. Too large, too muscular, with claws as long as my forearm and teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. What disturbed me the most were the deep, jagged gouges along its sides, as if something even larger had torn into it. A cold dread gripped me. I didn't linger. My curiosity quickly dissolved into panic, and I turned back, heart racing, legs moving faster than before. The forest felt different now, oppressive, alive with a sinister energy. The trees loomed closer, the air thick and strange. Unfamiliar sounds echoed from the depths of the woods. By the time I reached the RV, I was drenched in sweat, though I couldn't tell if it was from fear or exertion. I decided to stay close to the RV for the rest of the day, feeling foolish for wandering so far into the wilderness. I tried to distract myself, cooking, reading, even sketching the view of the lake, but my thoughts kept circling back to that creature, to the crushing unease that had followed me out of the woods. As night fell, the atmosphere around the lake shifted. The air grew heavier, the silence almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. I forced myself to follow my evening routine, but I couldn't relax. Even as I sat by the fire, my eyes darted to the dark tree line, searching for any sign of movement. Then I heard it. A distant, echoing roar, low, guttural, like thunder rolling through the trees. It rattled my bones. My heart slammed against my ribs as I froze, listening intently. But the roar didn't come again. Still, the sound lingered in the air, pressing down on me, leaving my skin crawling. I scrambled into the RV, locking the door behind me. It felt like nothing more than a flimsy shield between me and whatever was out there. I checked the windows, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the driver's seat, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Hours passed in tense silence. The fire crackled and popped, but the forest remained still, as though it were holding its breath. I drifted off to sleep, but my rest was short-lived. I woke to the sound of something heavy moving around the RV. The vehicle swayed slightly with each step. My heart pounded, my breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was massive, too massive to be any animal I knew. The RV shook again, this time more violently, as if something was testing its strength, pushing against it from outside. I wanted to believe it was just a bear, but deep down, I knew better. I could feel the same primal dread closing in, wrapping around my chest like a vice. My hands shook as I reached for the kitchen knife I'd left on the counter. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all I had. The creature outside let out another low, rumbling growl. It was deeper, resonating through the very air as though the sound was vibrating in my bones. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence pressing against the thin metal and glass that separated us. The RV trembled under its weight, circling slowly, methodically, as though it was savoring the moment, deciding how best to tear its way inside. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The RV fell still. The air was thick with tension, the silence unbearable. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake, eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the creature to return, but it never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I hurried outside. Massive, deep footprints, clawed and unmistakable, circled the RV. They were like nothing I had ever seen, too large, too unnatural. I wasted no time. As soon as the sun crested the trees, I started the RV and drove off, faster than I should have, speeding down narrow, winding roads until I reached the nearest town. There, at a crowded gas station, I finally allowed myself to breathe. When I told the locals about what I'd seen, they didn't laugh. They didn't call me crazy. They just nodded grimly, muttering about the beast of Black River. An old legend, they said. Some swore it was a giant wolf, others a demon of the forest. Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain: it was real. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out more. I returned the RV that afternoon, pretending everything had gone smoothly, but as I drove back to the city, a deep, gnawing feeling settled in my chest. Black River had taken something from me, a sense of safety I hadn't even realized I'd valued until it was gone. And as the city skyline loomed in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods was still out there, watching. I don't normally talk about the past, but something about the silence of the Oregon wilderness makes you want to. Maybe it's the solitude, or maybe the vastness, the endless horizon that stretches out and makes a man look inward, question the choices he's made. I was once a civil engineer, shaping the world with concrete and steel, city streets, urban sprawls, things that made the world hum with life. It was good work, honest work. But after my wife passed 3 years ago, the buzz of the city, the constant churn of people and noise became unbearable. I sold the house, bought an old RV, and started chasing the quiet. I wanted to escape, to find something real, something that didn't remind me of what I'd lost. This time, I found myself in the heart of Mount Hood National Forest, deep in the woods, a place where the trees close in like dark, looming sentinels, a place few people know about. I thought it would be perfect, just me and the wilderness. It was late afternoon when I parked the RV in a small clearing by a creek. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I breathed deeply, the tension in my body unwinding with each breath. It felt like a world away from the life I had left behind. I set up camp quickly, firewood gathered, a fire pit dug, my camp chair facing the creek. The sound of the rushing water filled my ears, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. For the first time in years, I felt a fleeting peace, the kind of peace that wraps around you like a blanket, warm and comforting. The quiet was everything I had been searching for. As the night crept in, I cooked a simple meal over the fire, beans and bacon, nothing fancy. I hadn't seen another soul all day, and that was just how I liked it. After dinner, I sat back in my chair, sipping a can of cheap beer, letting the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl fill the air. The stars began to dot the sky, one by one like diamonds on black velvet. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. But then, from the silence came a sound. It was faint, barely perceptible over the fire's crackle, a low, rhythmic thud. Thud, thud, thud. My hand tightened around the beer can, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I stood, slowly, straining to listen. It came again, closer this time. Thud, thud, thud. I froze. That sound, it wasn't right. It didn't belong in these woods. I turned, trying to locate where it was coming from. The sound seemed to be coming from beyond the creek, deeper in the forest, where the shadows swallowed the light. I listened hard, my ears straining, but the thudding stopped. Just the wind now rustling the leaves. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. A bear, maybe? An elk? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. And I went back to the RV, locked the door behind me, and crawled into bed. But sleep didn't come. My mind raced. The thudding echoed in my head, louder now, like a drum beating a warning I didn't want to hear. The night stretched on, fragmented dreams filled with shadows creeping through the trees and that unshakable thudding. I woke with a jolt, my heart pounding in my chest. Something slammed into the side of the RV, hard enough to make the entire vehicle shudder. I sat up, frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Silence followed. The kind of unnatural silence that presses in on you, makes your skin crawl. I waited, tense, listening. but there was nothing. I grabbed the flashlight from under the bed and moved to the window, peeking out. At first, there was nothing but darkness, just the faint outlines of trees. Then I saw it. A shadow, a large, hunched figure near the creek. My breath hitched. It was too big for a bear, too bulky. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but it couldn't make sense of what it was seeing. The creature, whatever it was, hunched low to the ground. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted, and wrong. Its back arched painfully, like it was broken. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it was searching for something or someone. I pulled back from the window, my heart hammering. What the hell was that? I've spent years in the wilderness, seen everything from wolves to mountain lions, but this thing was something else. I couldn't just sit there, helpless. I grabbed the shotgun my father had given me, old but reliable, loaded it with shaking hands, and crept back to the window. The creature was closer now. It moved like it was testing the air, its head swiveling as though listening for something. And then, with a shock that nearly stopped my heart, I realized it didn't have a face. Just smooth, featureless skin, where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. My stomach churned. What kind of thing has no face? It stopped moving. Then it straightened up. It was at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur, or something worse, something rough and spiky. I aimed the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger. My hands shook violently, but I couldn't let this thing get any closer. I fired. The blast was deafening, rattling the RV's walls, and the creature made a sound that wasn't a scream. It was low, vibrating, something deep and unnatural that shook my bones. The thing stumbled back, clutching its side. For a moment, I thought I'd done it. But then it straightened up again, its faceless head turning slowly toward me. I fired again, and again. The shots didn't seem to faze it. It staggered, yes, but it didn't fall. It just kept coming. Its limbs unfolded in grotesque, unnatural angles, jerking like a puppet on broken strings. I fumbled with the shotgun, my hands trembling too much to reload. The thing was almost at the door now. Its movements quickened, inhuman, predatory. In a desperate panic, I threw open the RV door and fired point blank. The blast sent the creature staggering back, crashing to the ground with a thud that shook the earth beneath me. I didn't wait to see if it would rise again. I started the RV, slammed it into gear, and tore out of that clearing as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. The sheriff's office didn't believe me at first, but they sent a search party. They found my campsite, torn apart like something massive had rampaged through it. No sign of the creature, but blood stains on the ground confirmed I hadn't imagined it. The sheriff said it was probably a bear or maybe a cougar. But I knew better. I know what I saw. I'm done with the wilderness now. I'll find another way to escape. Somewhere with more people, less chance of running into something that doesn't belong in this world, because whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. And I won't be going back. Not ever. We had planned the trip as a much-needed escape from the relentless grind of our city lives. A weekend RV camping getaway in the mountains, far from civilization, surrounded by dense, towering trees and the quiet hum of nature. It seemed perfect. We found a secluded spot deep in the forest, a hidden pocket nestled in the shadows of towering, whispering pines, their needles swaying in the wind like dark, skeletal fingers. It was isolated, peaceful, but we had no idea what we had walked into. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sinister shadows across the campsite as we settled in. The RV parked next to a small, bubbling creek, its soft gurgle barely audible over the crackle of our campfire. The flames flickered and twisted, casting eerie, ever-changing shapes that seemed to move on their own, as though the trees were alive, watching. We laughed, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories, easing ourselves into the spirit of the night, blissfully unaware that something far more sinister was watching us. As the darkness deepened, a strange chill seeped into the air, far colder than any mountain breeze should have been. It felt unnatural, like the warmth was being sucked from the very atmosphere, leaving only an unsettling void. But we laughed it off, brushing it aside as just a normal part of being deep in the woods. Yet there was something undeniably wrong. At first I thought it was nothing, a flicker in my peripheral vision, a slight shift between the trees, but then it happened again and again. Tiny figures darted in the shadows, too quick to make out clearly. I stared, convinced it was just the play of firelight. But no, the figures were moving with purpose, darting from tree to tree. Slowly, a creeping dread formed in my chest as I realized they weren't just shadows. They were things. My breath caught in my throat when I saw them more clearly. No taller than a foot, their pale faces gleamed in the moonlight, and their eyes, black, beady, and endless, watched us with an unnerving intensity. They were small, too small, but their presence powerful. My friends caught sight of them too. Nervous laughter rippled through our group as we tried to dismiss it. Just a trick of the light, an illusion, right? But the figures weren't illusions. They were real. And as the night deepened, more of them appeared, scurrying, skittering, weaving in and out of the shadows, a growing, crawling presence. Tiny hands reached out as though beckoning us, or worse, grabbing for something. I felt a shiver claw down my spine, but still we sat, trying to convince ourselves it was all in our heads. Then the wind picked up. A thin, whispering breeze stirred through the pines, almost too faint to hear. But it wasn't the wind, it was the voices. Faint, high-pitched, like a chant rising from the heart of the forest. The little figures began to emerge from the trees in greater numbers, their movements faster now, frantic. Their whispers became a cacophony, a frantic, urgent murmur. They were communicating with each other, and something more was coming. The atmosphere thickened. The fire's warmth no longer reached us, as if the cold was coming from inside our bones. We huddled closer together, our hearts pounding in our chests, but it was clear we weren't alone. Something was circling us, waiting. Mike, always the brave one, grabbed a flashlight, his hands trembling as he moved to the edge of the camp. He shined the beam into the dark woods. The little figures scattered, disappearing into the shadows, but behind them something moved, something larger. Mike's face drained of color when he returned, barely able to speak. He had seen it, something else, towering and dark, lurking just behind the tiny figures, its presence suffocating. Panic surged through us. We didn't need to see it to know it was no longer safe. We needed to leave. We scrambled to pack up, our hands shaking, our breath quickening, the little creatures watching us from the trees, their unblinking eyes glimmering in the dim light. But just as we started to move, a terrifying sound erupted from the forest. A scream, a shriek from the depths of the woods. And then the little figures, their movements now chaotic, frenzied, burst from the trees. There were dozens of them, at least 30, all sprinting toward us, their tiny clawed feet beating a frantic, pattering rhythm on the forest floor. Their high-pitched cries rose in a deafening chorus, a chant full of malice and desperation. We dove into the RV, slamming the door behind us, but the cold had already seeped into our bones. Our hearts raced, thundering in our ears as the little creatures, no longer small but monstrous in their numbers, pounded toward us, faster, closer. Their chant filled the air, their voices high and shrill, and we could feel their presence, hunting us. The engine roared to life. Tires screeched on the gravel as we sped down the narrow forest road, the RV shaking beneath us as if it too felt the weight of the chase. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, all of them, still running, their bodies growing smaller, but their relentless pursuit never faltering. They were not stopping. They would never stop. We drove faster, heartbeats in our throats, not daring to look back until the distant lights of a town appeared on the horizon. We didn't stop until we were safely out of the woods. But even then, as we sat there gasping for air, the eerie chill that had taken root in the pit of our stomachs refused to leave. We stared at each other, our faces pale, each of us silent, too terrified to speak. The little people were gone. But the forest, that place, it lingered. Its shadows reached for us, even from miles away, like an unseen hand pressing against the back of our minds. We had seen only a sliver of what lay hidden in those woods. Some things I now know are better left undisturbed. To this day, when I close my eyes, I hear their chants. I see their tiny faces, their black, empty eyes. And I feel their pursuit, a reminder that sometimes the forest doesn't want to be left alone. The secrets it holds are better left buried in the darkness, where they can never find you. There's a strange freedom in having no fixed address, something about it that clears your head. I said that to Mark a few months ago, sitting at a dive bar in Omaha. We were reminiscing about simpler days, days when the only real worry was scrounging up enough gas money for the next adventure. I've always been a wanderer. After my dad left, it was just me and my mom, hopping from place to place, never staying long enough to get attached. Maybe that's why I'm good at making friends, leaving without a trace. I thought it was enough. But then came the grind, 20 years at a desk, crunching numbers until I couldn't breathe anymore. So I quit. Took my savings, bought a used 2003 Airstream RV, and for the first time in my life, I had a home that could go wherever I wanted. It was supposed to be freedom, just me, the open road, and the wild unknown. But that was before all of this. My name's Keith Matthews. People say I'm likable, mostly because I've got that easygoing attitude. Always calm, always in control. But it's all a facade, isn't it? Beneath the calm, I'm just a man running from something. Maybe from myself. A week ago, I drove my Airstream out to the Black Hills in South Dakota. The plan? Find a remote spot by a lake, disappear into the wilderness for a few days, hike, fish, and bask in the silence. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. No need to. It was just me and nature. At least, that's what I thought. The spot I found was perfect. A small, nameless lake nestled between dense pine forests, untouched, isolated, no other campers or hikers for miles. It felt primal, like the land itself had forgotten time, like it was waiting for me. The first night was idyllic. I cooked steaks over an open fire, listened to the crackling wood, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace. The world fell away. I should have known better. It was the next morning when I first noticed something wrong. After breakfast, I was preparing for a hike when I saw it. Something had disturbed the ground near the lake's edge. The earth was flattened in a trail about 30 feet long, heading into the woods. At first, I thought maybe a bear had passed through, or a moose, but there were no tracks, just a swath of trampled grass. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I followed it into the woods. The trees grew thicker, the trail winding deeper than I expected. After 100 yards, I reached a clearing and froze. A pile of bones. Fresh bones. Human bones. Ribs, skulls, limbs, jumbled together in a grotesque heap, still clinging to scraps of flesh. The sickening smell of rot hit me in waves, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat. Whoever or whatever had left this, it wasn't far. I could feel its presence, like the air had thickened around me. I couldn't stay. I turned and ran back to the RV, every nerve screaming. But as I reached the camp, I froze again. Something was wrong. The lake, the trees, the silence was wrong. An unnatural stillness gripped the air. I locked myself inside the RV that night. Every window, every door, secure. The silence outside was absolute, oppressive. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. Then I heard it. A scratch. A scrape against the door. It started soft, barely perceptible, but then it grew louder, more frantic, as if something was desperate to get in. I could feel my pulse in my ears, cold sweat gathering on my forehead. Whatever was outside, it wasn't just some animal. No animal would make that sound. I grabbed the hunting knife from my bedside drawer and moved to the door, inching closer, trying to peek out through the small window. But it was too dark. Then came the thud. A heavy slam against the side of the RV, shaking the whole vehicle. Claws scraped the metal. My heart was pounding, throat tight with fear. It wasn't just scratching, it was trying to tear through. I couldn't stay inside. I had to make a move. The scratching continued, moving along the side of the RV. It was circling me. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, holding my breath, then threw it open and ran, fast as I could. The underbrush tore at my legs as I plunged deeper into the woods, my only thought to get away, to hide. I glanced back once, just once, and saw it. A hulking shape, massive, monstrous, its outline barely visible in the dark. A bear. No, not a bear. It was something else, something primal, something ancient. Its body was like that of a bear, but its neck, it stretched unnaturally long like a serpent. Its head, God, its head was a hideous fusion of wolf and reptile, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. I ran until my legs burned, until I thought I'd collapse. Then I stumbled into another clearing. No cover, nothing, just open space. And then I heard it again, a growl. But it wasn't just any growl, it was deep, guttural, like the earth itself was shaking. It was close, too close. I turned, my heart freezing in my chest. There it was, standing in the clearing, watching me. It was even bigger up close, its fur thick and matted, its breath visible in the cold air. I gripped the knife tighter, but I knew. It wouldn't matter. Nothing would. It moved toward me with terrifying speed, back its giant paws thudding against the earth. I didn't wait for it to get closer. I swung the knife, desperate, slashing at its face. The blade cut deep, but the creature barely flinched. It roared, a sound that shook my bones, and swiped at me with a paw the size of a trash can lid. The impact threw me to the ground, the wind knocked out of me. I struggled to rise, but the creature was on me in a heartbeat, pinning me down with its immense weight. I gasped for air, my vision blurring, the creature's hot breath on my face. This was it. I was done. But then, a crack, sharp and sudden. The creature recoiled, a howl of pain ripping from its throat. Another crack, and it collapsed beside me. I didn't understand what was happening. I couldn't. My mind was foggy, too overwhelmed to process. But then I heard a voice. Over here. It's down. A group of men emerged from the woods, rifles in hand. They were all dressed in camo, their faces hard and grim. The man who spoke was tall, grizzled, with a thick beard. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. I nodded, too stunned to speak. "Good. We've been tracking this thing for weeks," he said, looking down at the creature's body. "Damn thing's been killing anything that gets near its territory." I stared at the beast, trying to wrap my head around it, but the pieces wouldn't fit. "We need to get moving," the man said. "There could be more." I didn't argue. I followed them, away from the nightmare, into the woods, away from the creature, from the death that nearly claimed me. By the time we reached their camp, dawn was breaking. The sky was a pale gray, and the men offered me food, but I couldn't eat. I just sat by the fire, numb, staring at the flames. "You did good," the man said, handing me a cup of coffee. "Most people would have frozen up. You fought back." I nodded, my voice hollow. "Lucky," I whispered. The men packed their gear. They said they'd take me back to civilization, but I knew better than to ask about the creature or the truth of what happened. Some things are better left buried. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest, now bathed in the soft morning light. It looked peaceful, serene, but I knew the truth now. There are things out there, things that shouldn't exist, and I survived an encounter with one of them. We had been eagerly anticipating our RV camping trip for weeks, and the promise of seclusion in the deep forest felt like a perfect escape from the suffocating noise of daily life. The trees were dense, and the air still, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for us to step inside. We found a secluded spot nestled in the shadows of towering pines, their branches reaching high into the sky like gnarled hands. The isolation was almost unnerving, but it was exactly what we needed, until it wasn't. After setting up our tent and organizing the RV, we settled in for a quiet evening, the kind we had dreamed of. The plan was simple: roast marshmallows, enjoy the tranquility, and leave the world behind. But just as the first hint of a peaceful silence fell over the campsite, a figure emerged from the dense darkness. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light, an illusion conjured by the deep shadows. But no, a frail old woman materialized out of nowhere, as though the very darkness had birthed her. Her clothes were ragged, hanging from her body in tatters. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide, unblinking, and filled with an unnerving confusion. Her gray hair streamed wild behind her, tangled like a bird's nest, as if it hadn't been brushed in years, or perhaps decades. "Grandma Edna," she said in a cracked voice, as if the words had to fight their way out of her throat. She explained in a rambling haze that she had been abandoned by her son deep in the woods. My heart clenched with pity. I couldn't leave her out there, alone and lost. With no cell service, no way of calling for help, I couldn't bear the thought of her wandering these dark woods without any protection. We offered her our spare tent, promising we'd take her back home the next day once we could find a signal. She nodded silently, as though relieved by our offer, and we made sure she was settled in before returning to our own camp. The night was eerily quiet. I tried to sleep, but found myself tossing and turning, unease gnawing at my gut. I stepped outside for a smoke, needing to clear my head. The air was unnaturally still, pressing in around me. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. I was lost in my thoughts when I noticed a flickering light near the campfire. It was Grandma Edna. I froze. She was sitting by the fire, her back turned to me. The flames danced in her wide, vacant eyes, casting long, grotesque shadows across her face. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The glow of the fire illuminated something wrong, something horrifying. Her tongue. It wasn't just long, it was grotesquely long. It stretched from her mouth, curling unnaturally as it flicked toward the flames. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slither out of her mouth, an impossible length licking the fire. She was savoring it, tasting the heat with an almost deliberate curiosity, her tongue twisting and flicking as though it were a living thing, a serpent tasting the air. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The flickering shadows distorted her face, and the sight of that long, obscene tongue, sliding and curling like something alive, made my blood run cold. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I was too terrified to make a sound, too frozen in place. I backed away slowly, the image of her twisted form burned into my mind. I crept into the RV, locking the door behind me, my hands trembling. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with terror, too afraid to tell my husband. I clung to the hope that it was just a nightmare, that the world outside was still safe. But when I woke the next morning, Grandma Edna was gone. Her tent was empty. The space where she had been was eerily untouched. We searched the area, calling her name, but there was nothing. No trace, no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. We decided to leave, to get out of the woods as quickly as we could. As we packed up, I kept glancing back, hoping to see her, hoping that the nightmare would somehow make sense. But it wasn't until we reached the edge of the forest that I saw her again. She stood by the side of the road, her face barely visible in the shadows, watching us. My heart stopped. There, from between the trees, I could see her tongue. Long, unnaturally thin, it flickered in the morning light like a serpent's tongue, moving with an unsettling speed, tasting the air. My husband didn't see her. I couldn't bring myself to tell him. I didn't want to speak her name, didn't want to acknowledge what I had seen. We drove faster, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, but I dared not look again. The woods were behind us, but the image of her, of that twisted, impossible tongue, remained. It still haunts me. What was she? What was really out there in the woods? The forest remains a place I avoid at all costs, and every time I see a campfire, the flickering flames send a shiver down my spine. I know now that some things are better left undisturbed, hidden in the darkest corners of the earth. Some things belong in the shadows, and I will never forget the chilling sight of Grandma Edna's tongue, writhing in the flames. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a break from the relentless buzz of city life. I'd been working as a construction supervisor for 15 years, hard, honest work that wears you thin over time. But after my wife died 2 years ago, the only solace I found was in long, exhausting hours on site and weekend fishing trips that took me as far away from the noise of the world as possible. I wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but the water had a way of calming the storm in my head. My name's Quinn, and this is how I ended up in that godforsaken part of the Appalachians. I'd heard whispers of a secluded spot near Fontana Lake in North Carolina, a place where the trees grew so thick they swallowed sound and the waters ran clear, a place where you could park your RV, set up camp, and not see another soul for miles. It sounded perfect. I packed my gear, grabbed enough supplies for a week, and hit the road in my old Winnebago. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, spindly shadows through the dense canopy. The lake lay still like a sheet of glass, reflecting the fiery colors of the setting sun. There was something almost surreal about the quietness. No distant hum of traffic, no chatter of people, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional cry of a bird. I parked the RV in a small clearing, not far from the water's edge. The place was even more isolated than I'd imagined. No cell service, no nearby cabins, nothing but nature in every direction. It felt like stepping back in time to a world untouched by modern conveniences. I liked that. The first day passed without incident. I spent the morning fishing, caught a few smallmouth bass, and cooked them over a fire for lunch. In the afternoon, I explored the surrounding woods, marking my path with bits of bright orange tape. The forest was dense with towering oaks and thick underbrush, so dense that it was easy to lose your bearings. But I'd always had a good sense of direction, and I wasn't worried about getting lost. That night, I sat by the campfire, savoring the peace. The stars were out in full force, more than I'd seen in years. The moon hung low and bright in the sky, casting an eerie light across the clearing. I felt a strange sense of contentment, like I'd finally found a place where I could clear my head. I turned in early, eager to rest and start the next day fresh. I woke up just after midnight to a sound I couldn't place, a low rumbling coming from deep within the forest. At first, I thought it might be a bear. I'd seen a few tracks earlier, and I'd taken care to secure my food inside the RV. But this sound was different, more primal, if that makes any sense. It wasn't loud, but it had a presence, a resonance that rattled my bones. I lay still, listening, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, closer, like something massive was moving through the woods, slowly, deliberately. My heart began to pound. This wasn't a bear. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin. The forest was darker than I'd ever seen, the fire reduced to nothing more than glowing embers casting long, flickering shadows. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, but the beam only pierced a short distance into the thick underbrush. And then I saw it. A massive shape moved between the trees, just at the edge of the light. It was huge, easily the size of a grizzly, but there was something off about it, something unnatural in the way it moved, like it wasn't walking but gliding. It moved on all fours, but with an eerie fluidity, as though it were more shadow than flesh. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The creature circled the clearing, staying just out of sight. My instincts screamed at me to run, to lock myself inside, but my legs wouldn't move. Then came the sound, the unmistakable snap of a tree limb breaking under the weight of something heavy. I knew then that this was real, and it was hunting me. I backed toward the RV, trying to keep my movements slow and steady. I heard a guttural snarl, deep and filled with a rage that vibrated in my chest. The creature lunged forward, its massive body crashing through the underbrush. I dove to the side, barely escaping as it barreled past me, missing me by inches. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the RV, my heart hammering in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the shotgun I kept in the storage compartment. I loaded it as quickly as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Outside, I could hear the creature circling the RV. Its heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel. The windows rattled as it brushed against the side, and I feared it would tear its way inside. I waited in the dark, shotgun in hand, muscles coiled tight, every sense heightened. It never came. Instead, the creature seemed to lose interest, its heavy footsteps growing fainter as it retreated into the woods. I stayed awake all night, listening for any sign of its return. But the forest was eerily silent, unnervingly so, as though every living thing had still hiding from whatever hunted in the dark. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, shotgun ready. The clearing looked unchanged, peaceful, undisturbed. But as I walked around the RV, I saw the deep gouges in the ground where the creature had charged me. Twisted branches hung broken from the trees it had torn through. Whatever it was real. And it was powerful. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to encounter it again. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands still shaking as I stowed away my gear. A deep, primal fear gnawed at me, telling me I was in over my head. I had to get out. Fast. As I started to pull out of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something moved in the trees. My heart leapt into my throat. I whipped around, half expecting the creature to come charging out of the woods again. But no. Instead, there was a man. A tall, gaunt figure dressed in tattered clothes. His skin was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I slammed my foot on the gas, the RV lurching forward as I sped down the narrow forest road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the man to follow. But there was nothing. Only the dust kicked up by my tires. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, my grip tight on the wheel. Every nerve in my body was on edge. It wasn't until I reached a small town at the edge of the forest that I started to relax, the adrenaline finally starting to drain from my system. I pulled into a gas station and parked the RV. My hands still shook as I stepped inside. The attendant gave me a curious look, but I didn't say anything. I bought a cup of coffee, sat down at one of the tables, and tried to steady my nerves. But I couldn't stop thinking about that man. Who was he? What was he doing out there? And what had that creature been? I couldn't understand any of it. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I never went back to Fontana Lake, never spoke of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows stretch long across the floor, I can still hear it, the faint sound of something moving through the trees. And I wonder if that man is still out there, watching, waiting. It started like any other weekend, or so I thought. An impromptu RV trip to Allegan National Forest to clear my head. The job at the law firm had been draining, suffocating, endless hours, back-to-back cases, clients who demanded more than I could give. But that's the price of success, isn't it? I needed to escape. I longed for solitude, to be far from the noise of the city, the relentless tug of deadlines. The deep, suffocating quiet of the forest was the only balm I could find for my weary mind. I arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky bleeding into purples and reds. The trees around me stood tall, like silent sentinels watching over the land. I found the perfect spot to park, secluded, hidden by the thick underbrush. No one would find me here, not tonight. No distractions, no reminders of the life I had left behind. Just me, a cold beer, and the stars above. I set up camp with deliberate speed, leaving behind all the usual comforts. No fire, no elaborate setup, just the essentials, a chair, a drink, and a mind screaming for peace. Sitting there in the cool air, the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind. I allowed my thoughts to drift, the silence almost oppressive, but at least it was my silence. I thought about my ex-wife, the divorce that had stripped me to my core. It had taken everything, the facade, the wealth, the titles, and left me with just the raw, broken pieces of who I was. But I wasn't bitter. I had a successful career, money to spare, the means to escape whenever I wished. And I had learned to appreciate these moments, moments of stillness where nothing but the wind and my thoughts existed. That was the illusion anyway. But then the wind stopped. The forest went unnervingly still, the heavy silence pressing in around me like a living thing. It wasn't just quiet, it felt wrong, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a primal unease creeping over me. But I brushed it off. Attributing it to the anxiety that always settled in when I was alone in the woods at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. I finished my beer, threw the can into the trash bag, and headed back to the RV. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, or maybe I was just overtired. As I lay in bed, the quiet stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The sensation of being watched gripped me, cold fingers creeping up my spine. I opened my eyes. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, moving in the corners of my vision. It's nothing, I told myself, just the dark. Then I heard it, a rustling outside, soft, subtle, but there. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen, listening. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the brush just outside the RV. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, my hands shaking uncontrollably. This was supposed to be a peaceful escape, I thought. Not some goddamn horror movie. I opened the RV door, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The trees stood still, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers in the dim light. I stepped outside, the cool earth beneath my boots grounding me, but my heart was hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the silence, but the forest gave no answer. I was about to retreat back inside when something caught my eye. A movement, swift and unnatural. Something massive, weaving through the trees with an agility that should have been impossible. It moved like a shadow, too fast, too fluid. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I had ever seen before. Panic shot through me. I backed up toward the RV, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hand, my body moving on pure instinct. The creature moved again, closer this time, too close for comfort. It was on all fours, but it didn't move like any animal I knew. Its body contorted in unnatural ways like it was some twisted mockery of a creature. My mind couldn't make sense of it. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. Outside, I heard it, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching over gravel. It was circling the RV, methodical, like it was toying with me. I locked the door, but deep down I knew it wouldn't help. It was just a matter of time before it got in. I could hear its breath, ragged and wet, just outside. It wasn't just hunting me. It was savoring my fear. The footsteps stopped, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. For a moment, I dared to believe it had gone, but then, thud! A massive strike against the side of the RV. The whole vehicle shuddered, nearly throwing me off balance. It was testing the walls, searching for a weak spot. I backed away, my mind spiraling. The RV felt small, fragile, trapped in a metal coffin with something out there that wanted in. And then it hit again, a heavier thud. The sound of metal cracking, bending. It was trying to get in. I grabbed whatever I could find, a kitchen knife, a flashlight, and steadied myself. The silence stretched, suffocating. The creature paused, its breath coming in ragged, excited gasps. It was waiting for something. The air was thick, electric with tension. Then it happened. With a crash that rattled my bones, the creature slammed into the RV, its enormous body forcing its way through the window. Glass exploded inward, and I swung the flashlight in a wild arc, the metal striking something with a sickening thud. It barely made a dent. The creature was massive, bigger than any bear, its body thick with muscle and covered in matted, filthy fur. But it was its face that haunted me. The grotesque, nightmarish parody of a human face, elongated, its mouth filled with teeth that weren't teeth at all, but shards of bone, jagged and grotesque. It snarled, a low rumble that vibrated through the air, and before I could react, it swiped at me with terrifying speed. I was sent flying across the RV, my side slamming into the counter, pain shooting through my body. My head spun, and for a moment I was disoriented. Helpless. The creature loomed over me, its breath hot and rancid as it leaned in, its jaws opening wide. Desperation clawed at me. I groped around blindly, my hand brushing against something, a flare gun buried under a pile of supplies. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it and fired just as the creature lunged. The flare shot forward, hitting the creature square in the chest. It screamed. No, shrieked. A sound so high-pitched and filled with agony that it made my teeth ache. The creature thrashed violently, its massive body slamming into the walls, the roof. It tried to dislodge the flare, but the fire burned deeper, tearing into its flesh. The creature's screams became desperate, frantic, until with one final shudder, it collapsed. Its body twitched and jerked, but the fire from the flare smoldered in its chest, finally extinguishing the creature's life. For a long, suffocating moment, I stood frozen, my body trembling with the remnants of adrenaline. The creature lay still, its body twitching as the last remnants of life drained away. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, bolted out of the RV, and ran to the truck. my legs unsteady, my mind too shattered to make sense of what had just happened. I drove. Didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The police station. I stumbled out of the truck, covered in cuts, bruises, my clothes torn and soaked in blood. The officers listened to my story, skeptical at first, but when they saw the state I was in, they knew something had happened, something they couldn't explain. The next day, they found the creature's body, or what was left of it. The local news ran the story as a bizarre animal attack. Something about a mutated bear, maybe radiation, but I knew better. I knew. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything from this world. But I didn't correct them, let them believe their own comforting lies. I was just glad to be alive, and I'd never go back to the forest again. Last summer, my friends and I decided to escape the relentless noise of the city and camp in a remote, isolated part of the forest we found online. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. No distractions, no interruptions, just nature and quiet. We rented an RV, packed it with food, games, and a few ghost stories for some extra thrills. Little did we know those stories would soon come to life, but in ways we never could have imagined. The journey to the campsite was long, the road narrow, and the trees so thick they seemed to close in around us. The sun was dipping below the horizon by the time we arrived, and the only light came from the RV's headlights as the evening crept toward us like a shadow. The air grew colder, heavier, and the dense forest seemed to whisper in a language we couldn't understand, as if the very trees held secrets we weren't meant to know. A strange unease settled over me, but I brushed it off as nerves. We set up camp quickly, the RV positioned near a small clearing, the only light coming from the flickering campfire we built. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, most of them silly, meant to evoke little more than laughter, but the atmosphere felt charged. The firelight danced, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The forest around us felt alive, watching. My friends joked nervously, but the unease lingered. As the night deepened, the darkness closed in, suffocating. We decided to call it a night. I was the last to climb into bed, double-checking that everything was locked, every door and window secure. I tried to sleep, but the strange noises outside, creaks, groans, distant rustling in the trees kept me awake. The forest was restless, but I tried to ignore it. Around midnight, I was jolted from my uneasy slumber by a loud thump. My heart hammered in my chest. I froze, straining to hear over the deafening beat of my pulse. Another thump. Louder. Closer. I crept to the small window beside my bunk, but the darkness beyond it was an impenetrable wall. The sound stopped, but a profound silence followed, deep and suffocating. I tried to lie back down, telling myself it was nothing. But then came the growl. Low. Rumbling. A sound so unnatural it felt as though it came from the very earth itself. I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming, or if something was truly out there, watching us. The growl was joined by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across the ground, slowly, agonizingly, as if the earth itself was being torn open. Then the world was swallowed by blinding light. A flash so sudden it sent a shockwave through my body, followed by an ear-splitting crash. I bolted out of bed, grabbing the flashlight and my phone, stumbling through the RV in panic. My friends were already awake, faces pale with fear, eyes wide, each of us trying to make sense of the terror that was seizing us. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice a terrified whisper. "Look," she pointed toward the window. We all crowded around, peering through the glass. What we saw made my blood freeze. Standing in the clearing beyond our RV was a monstrous figure, a human shape, but far from human. It towered above the trees, its broad shoulders stretching under the weight of enormous wings that unfurled like dark curtains. The wings seemed to pulse with a life of their own, coated in some unnatural substance, oily and black, gleaming in the dim moonlight. They flapped with a slow, agonizing rhythm, the sound like thunder reverberating through the forest. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural green like two smoldering embers. But the worst part, the part that rooted us to the spot, paralyzed with fear, was its face. It was hidden, obscured by shadows, but we could sense its gaze fixed on us, as if it knew us, as if it had been waiting. The creature screamed then, a scream so deafening it didn't just echo through the trees, it reverberated through our bones, shaking the RV's walls, rattling the very air around us. The screech dug into our skulls, making the ground beneath us tremble. I thought for a moment the RV might collapse, that the walls might buckle under the weight of its fury. Then the scraping started. We could hear it, sharp and relentless, claws dragging along the side of the RV. I could feel the metal groan, the vibrations coursing through the floor through my body. The sound grew louder, closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. We were trapped. There was no escape. In a blind panic, we scrambled to start the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. The lights flickered, and the desperate attempts to restart it only seemed to draw the creature closer. It was right outside now. We could hear its breath, hot and ragged, right on the other side of the walls. I could almost feel its claws scraping the metal, could almost hear the creature's hunger. Then, just when we thought it would tear through the RV and drag us into the forest, a blinding light flashed from the trees. A group of figures emerged from the darkness, carrying torches, shouting in guttural voices. The creature hissed, a sound of pure rage, and recoiled into the shadows. It was gone, but not without leaving its mark. The night was still, but the terror remained. The figures, locals, it seemed, rushed toward us, shouting for us to come out. We hesitated, fear still paralyzing us, but the creature's retreat gave us the courage to open the door. They explained that the forest was cursed, known for strange happenings, and that what we'd seen was a creature of legend, something born from the darkest corners of the forest. They escorted us out of the woods, their voices carrying an edge of urgency as they guided us back down the winding path. The trees seemed to close in behind us, pressing down with a suffocating weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. The giant winged figure had vanished, but the terror it had left behind lingered. None of us ever spoke of that night again, and none of us ever went back to those woods.